The wind carried dust across the high plains, curling it through the brittle grass and across the fences that marked the wide ranching land. The sky was pale, stretched thin above the horizon as if it had been scorched by years of hard sun. Out here, life was measured in seasons, in cattle brands, and in the quiet strength of men who worked the land from dawn to dark. It was a place where reputation carried farther than a rider's shout and where secrets, if a person had them, rarely stayed buried for long. The young rancher came into town that spring with a quiet look about him, the kind that made people turn their heads without knowing why. He was strong from years of riding and roping, but it was not only his hands that marked him as a man of the range. It was his steady eyes, the kind that had already seen too much for his age, and his silence, which spoke more than most men's words. Folks knew his father had been a cattleman before him, tough and unbending, and that the ranch he left behind had nearly broken apart during the last dry spell. Now the son carried the weight of rebuilding it, carrying it the way a man might carry a saddle too heavy for his back but refusing to set it down. It was in that same season that she appeared. The widow. Her wagon wheels creaked into town one afternoon, stirring talk as quick as a dust storm. She was striking in a way that made people pause. A woman alone, dressed in plain black, her face calm though her eyes held shadows. Nobody quite knew from where she had come. Some said back east, others whispered it was from down near the border. What everyone agreed on was this: she was alone, and the weight of her loss clung to her like a veil. In towns like this one, a widow did not go unnoticed. Men watched, women gossiped, and the preacher nodded solemnly as if he already knew the burden she carried. She found herself a small cabin not far from the edge of town, a place with peeling paint and a yard overrun with weeds. It should have looked sad, but somehow in her presence it felt like a place beginning again. She worked quietly, day after day, with a determination that matched the hard soil she planted in. The young rancher noticed her before he admitted it to himself. He would pass by on his way to the stockyards, the reins loose in his hand, his gaze drawn toward that lonely figure working by her fence. Something about her stirred a restlessness in him, though he could not have said what. Perhaps it was the way she kept to herself, not asking help, not seeking company, as if she had already learned not to rely on anyone. Or perhaps it was the faint smile she sometimes gave, quick and gone, like the sun slipping through storm clouds. It was not long before the town began to talk, as towns will. Whispers carried from porch to porch, across the counter at the mercantile, under the rafters of the saloon. The young rancher and the widow. Folks said he had stopped one afternoon to mend a loose board on her fence. Then another day he brought her fresh eggs from his hens. Small kindnesses, they called them, though in the telling they grew into something more. Soon the talk was that the widow had found herself a protector, and that the young rancher had found something he had not known he was looking for. Yet beneath the easy talk and glances, there was something else, something no one spoke of because no one could quite name it. The widow carried a stillness about her, the kind of stillness that did not come only from grief. It was as though she was listening for something, always waiting, as if the sound of distant hoofbeats or the cry of a rider on the trail might bring her past riding straight into her present. Her eyes, when they met his, were tender but guarded, and though she smiled at him, it was a smile that hid as much as it offered. The young rancher was not a man of many words. He had been raised to believe that a man's deeds told his story better than his tongue could. And so he did not question her past, nor did he press her when her gaze turned inward. But there were nights, as he lay under his roof listening to the coyotes cry across the hills, that he wondered what she kept locked away. He told himself it was not his business, that the present was enough. Still, the thought lingered like a thorn. What if the woman he had taken into his life was tied to something dark? The land had its way of pulling people close, binding them, with need and with a kind of trust that only hard living could create. And in time, the widow moved closer into the young rancher's world. She shared his fire, his food, and his silence. The neighbors nodded, some approving, some jealous, but all knowing that two people alone in a wide land often found their way to each other. For the rancher, it was simple. She filled the empty spaces left by years of loss, and her quiet presence steadied him. For the widow, it was more complicated. She gave herself to him, yes, but always with that shadow in her eyes, as if some part of her belonged not to him, nor to the present, but to something waiting just beyond the horizon. Then came the signs. At first, small things. A stranger's horse tied too long outside the saloon. A letter that arrived with no name on it, only her hands trembling as she folded it quickly away. A glance over her shoulder when the sun dipped low, her breath catching, as though she heard footsteps in the dark. The young rancher noticed, though he did not speak of it. But he felt the shift, the way unease crept into their days like a chill seeping under the door. One evening, as the light drained from the sky and the crickets began their restless song, the widow stood at the edge of the porch. Her face was turned toward the empty road, her eyes fixed as though she could see something far off that he could not. He came up beside her, his hand brushing hers, steady as the land itself. She leaned against him, but her voice, when it finally came, was low and heavy with a truth not yet spoken. "There's something I should have told you," she whispered. The rancher turned to her, his chest tightening. The night pressed close, the stars slow to rise. He waited, the way a man waits for a storm he cannot outrun. She did not finish. Her lips parted, her eyes filled with that shadow he had seen too many times, and she drew a long, shaking breath. Somewhere out on the prairie, a horse cried, sharp and lonely. And in that sound lay the promise that whatever secret she carried was about to ride into both their lives, and nothing would ever be the same. The night carried her whisper away, but the rancher heard it clear as if it had been carved into stone. He stood beside her, waiting, though she said no more. The prairie stretched before them, dark and wide, and the wind pressed against their skin as if urging them back inside. She stayed still, her shoulders stiff, her breath uneven. For a long moment, neither spoke, and then she turned from the road and went inside without another word. He followed, but the weight of what she had almost revealed hung between them. As heavy as the sky before a storm-dot sleep did not come easily that night. The rancher lay awake, listening to the creak of the old boards and the distant howl of coyotes. He thought of her face on the porch, the way her eyes had been fixed on the horizon, the way her voice had faltered. A man of the land learns to read signs, clouds that warn of rain, hoof prints that tell of strays, smoke on the horizon that could mean trouble. And he knew the signs in her too. She was holding back something that pressed hard against her heart, something dangerous enough to make her tremble. He wondered what could make a woman who had endured loss still fear the sound of footsteps on the road. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, yet charged with an unease that grew stronger. She moved through her chores as before, planting, cooking, tending to the small cabin, but her eyes seemed always to dart toward the distance. When riders passed, she turned her face away as if not to be recognized. Once, when a peddler stopped with his wagon of goods, she stayed hidden inside until the rancher told her it was safe to come out. He did not question her, though he longed. Too, she offered him warmth, kindness, even laughter in moments when the burden seemed to lift. Yet the secret she carried stood between them like a locked door. The rancher told himself that he could live without knowing. A man raised on hard ground understood that not every truth needed to be spoken, yet doubt gnawed at him. If her past was chasing her, what did that mean for him, for his ranch, for the life he was trying to build? He thought of his father, who had warned him before passing that trust was not something to give lightly. Still, when he looked at her, he found it hard to hold to that lesson. She had become a part of his days, and he could no longer picture his life without her presence. It was during branding season when the unease sharpened into something heavier. The rancher had spent long hours in the corral, the smell of singed hide rising with the dust, the cattle bawling as they were marked. Sweat and smoke clung to him when he returned to the cabin late in the evening. He expected to find her by the fire, but instead the cabin was dark, and she was nowhere in sight. Panic struck him sharper than he would have admitted. He searched the yard, the barn, the stretch of land that led toward the creek. At last, he found her on the ridge behind the cabin, standing still as a stone, her gaze locked on the empty horizon. When he called her name, she startled, as though pulled from a dream. He climbed to her side, and she turned to him with eyes wet from tears she had not let him see. For the first time, he reached for her shoulders, steadying her. "You don't have to stand alone against whatever this is," he told her, his voice low, rough from smoke and dust. She shook her head, her lips parting as though she might finally speak the truth. But then she pressed her face against his chest, silent, and he knew the moment had passed. He held her, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and told himself he would wait. The town, though, was not blind. Folks began to notice her quiet glances, her watchful way of living. In the saloon, talk grew sharper. Some said she was running from something, that maybe her late husband's death had not been as simple as folks believed. Others claimed she had kin back east who wanted her fortune, though no one could name what fortune she had. And then came the talk of outlaws, a band of riders seen not far from the northern trail, men known for leaving behind ruin. The widow's unease seemed to rise with those rumors, as though each whisper brought her closer to the truth she kept hidden. The rancher heard the talk too. He kept his silence, but inside he burned with questions. Each night he watched her more closely. The way her hands shook when she folded a letter she never showed him. The way her gaze swept the dark as if expecting someone to step out of it. One evening she startled at the sound of hooves pounding in the distance. The rider never came near the cabin, yet she gripped his arm so tightly her nails bit into his skin. She said nothing when it was over, only returned inside with her face pale as bone. As summer stretched on, the tension grew heavier. The rancher's cattle ranged far, and more than once he returned to find signs that someone had been near the cabin, a boot print in the dust too sharp to be his own. A cigarette butt left smoldering in the dirt by the barn. He tried not to alarm her, but he felt it in his bones someone was watching them. And deep down, he knew it was tied to the secret she carried. One night, a storm rolled in from the west, thunder cracking across the sky, rain pounding the dry earth. They sat inside by the fire, the storm rattling the windows, the shadows alive on the walls. She sat close to him, her hands clasped tight, her eyes shining with fear not of the storm but of something else. He touched her hand, steady and warm. "Whatever it is," he said, "you can tell me." Her lips trembled, her breath caught, and she turned to him with eyes full of sorrow. "If I tell you," she whispered, "you won't look at me the same." Before he could answer, the wind slammed the door open, and a flash of lightning revealed the dark figure of a rider out on the ridge, watching. The rancher moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But when the next flash came, the ridge was empty. Rain fell harder, and the night swallowed the figure whole. He turned back to her, but she had already moved to the corner, her hands covering her face. He crossed to her, kneeling, his heart pounding. "Who is it?" he asked. She shook her head, tears streaking down her cheeks. "It's not just me," she said. "If they've found me, they'll come for you too." Her words cut through him sharper than any blade. The storm roared around them, the cabin shuddering, the fire throwing wild shadows. He wanted to press her, to demand the truth, but the look in her eyes held him back. It was the look of a soul haunted, trapped between silence and confession. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as the storm raged, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. What past did she carry that reached this far into their lives? Who rode the ridge in the lightning's glare? And how long before? The secret she held tore through everything they had built together? The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean yet heavy with silence. The widow rose before him, her face pale but resolved. She moved with quiet purpose, as if preparing for something unseen. The rancher watched her, his chest tight, knowing that whatever road lay ahead, it was no longer just hers. It was theirs. Yet the truth still lay locked inside her, and the sound of distant hoofbeats still echoed in his mind, a warning that their days of peace were numbered. The days after the storm carried a heaviness that clung to the ranch like dust after a cattle drive. The widow moved through her chores with the same quiet grace, yet something in her had shifted. She was sharper now, her ears attuned to every sound, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting that rider to return at any moment. The young rancher felt it too. Though he went about his work with the cattle and the land, every creak of saddle leather, every faint echo of hooves in the distance kept his nerves drawn tight. He tried not to let it show, but the unease had settled into him like a stone he could not shake. Rumors drifted from town like smoke on the wind. Riders seen near the North Trail, a robbery on the stage line, strangers asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Folks in the saloon spoke of a man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, a man who led a small band with a reputation blacker than the soot of a burned-out barn. No one said his name loud, but the whispers carried. Some swore he had a grudge against a woman who had betrayed him. Others claimed he hunted gold owed to him, buried deep in the hills. Whatever the truth, each whisper seemed to coil itself around the widow's silence. The rancher listened but kept his mouth shut. Though his hands itched for the feel of his rifle stock. At night, he often found her standing at the window, looking out toward the dark. She said little, and he did not press, though her fear gnawed at him. It was not the fear of storms or outlaws in general. This was something deeper, sharper, as though she knew exactly what waited out there in the shadows. Once, when he asked her if she had enemies, she turned her face away and answered, "Only not enemies I chose." Her words struck him like a branding iron, hot and permanent, leaving him restless long after she had gone to bed. The land itself became part of the tension. The cattle drifted farther than usual, as though uneasy too. Coyotes circled close to the house at night, their cries echoing through the gullies. Even the horses grew skittish, pulling against their reins when a stranger passed too near. The rancher told himself it was coincidence, that the land had its own moods, but deep down, he knew it was all connected. Trouble was circling, and it was only a matter of time before it came straight to their door. One afternoon, a rider came from town with word. The sheriff wanted to see the rancher. He rode in the next morning, dust trailing behind him, and found the sheriff leaning against the porch of the jailhouse, hat pulled low against the sun. The lawman was a steady man, cautious, not quick to stir panic. Yet his eyes held the weight of bad news. "There's been questions about the woman," he said quietly. "Strangers asking if she lives near here. Men who don't give their names. I don't like the feel of it." The rancher felt his jaw tighten. "What did you tell them?" The sheriff gave him a long look. "I told them nothing. But secrets have a way of drawing men in like buzzards." When the rancher returned home, he found her waiting on the porch. She must have read the truth in his face, for she did not ask what the sheriff had said. Instead, she reached for his hand, her grip trembling though her eyes were steady. "I should have left before they found me," she whispered. The rancher pulled her closer, though his chest burned with questions. "Running won't solve it," he told her. "Whatever you're carrying, it'll follow until you face it." Her lips parted as if to speak, but again she swallowed her words, retreating into silence. The unease stretched into weeks, building like storm clouds on the horizon. Yet life on a ranch could not pause for fear. Calves were born, fences broke, water had to be hauled. Through it all, they worked side by side, their bond deepening even as shadows pressed closer. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been before her secret, laughing softly when the colt nipped at her dress, humming a tune as she kneaded bread. Those moments felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, but always the clouds closed again, heavy and dark. The townsfolk grew bolder with their questions. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife leaned close to the rancher and asked if he knew where the widow had come from. At the saloon, men nudged one another when he walked past, whispers trailing him like dust. He ignored them, but the pressure grew. He could feel the town watching, waiting for the moment the truth came out. It was not just his life tied to her now. It was his name, his ranch, his place among people who measured a man by his trustworthiness as much as his work. One evening, as dusk settled over the land, the rancher noticed smoke rising in the distance, thin and sharp against the sky. He saddled his horse and rode out, the widow watching him from the porch, her hands clenched at her sides. He found the remnants of a camp not far from his northern fence line, ashes still warm, boot prints circling. The fire and a brand of tobacco he did not recognize. His stomach tightened. Whoever had been there had been close, too close. When he returned, he told her only that strangers were near. She did not answer, but he saw the way her face paled, the way her eyes flicked to the horizon. That night she finally spoke, though not the full truth. "There was a man once," she said softly, staring into the fire. "He thought he owned me, thought I had no choice but to stay by his side. When I tried to leave, he swore he'd find me. He swore he'd never stop." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands together, knuckles white. "If he's still alive, it's him. He's the one out there." The rancher's chest tightened, but he did not let anger show. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her, steady and sure, yet inside, rage burned like wildfire. If a man had sworn to hunt her, then the danger was not only real, it was already at their door. The tension stretched into a thread ready to snap. Nights grew restless. Every sound outside the cabin felt like a warning. The rancher kept his rifle within reach, his eyes sharp as he moved through each day. The widow drifted between strength and sorrow, at times standing tall as if ready to face whatever came, at others folding into herself with fear she could not hide. Their bond deepened, yet so did the weight of what was coming. It was as though the prairie itself held its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would break into violence. In town, the sheriff confided that men had been seen riding near the river, armed and watchful. A storehouse had been raided, supplies taken. Folks muttered of outlaws, but the sheriff suspected more. He asked the rancher if he knew why strangers would linger near his land. The rancher shook his head, though he felt the lie cut into him. He would not betray her secret, not even to the law. Yet that lie chained him to the danger even tighter. By late summer, the widow's secret was no longer just hers. It was his too, a shadow over both their lives. He could not send her away, he would not, but he could feel the world tightening around them. Strangers drew nearer. Rumors sharpened. And though no confrontation had yet come, it was as if the whole land held the echo of hoofbeats, warning them that time was running short. The air grew heavier with each passing day, as if the land itself braced for something that could no longer be held back. The young rancher felt it in the silence of the cattle, in the way the dogs bristled at shadows, in the restless way the widow moved about the cabin. She tried to keep steady, tending to her chores, humming under her breath, pretending that nothing had changed. But he could see it in her eyes. Every knock of hoof against rock, every faint echo of riders in the distance, turned her face pale. She no longer walked to the ridge at night. She stayed close to the cabin, and when he stepped outside she would stand in the doorway, as though afraid he might not return. In town, the whispers sharpened into warnings. The sheriff rode out to the ranch one evening with his jaw tight and his eyes grim. He told the rancher that strangers had been spotted. At the edge of the river valley, men who did not belong, men who rode hard and carried rifles across their saddles. Supplies had gone missing from a freight wagon, and 2 travelers spoke of being followed along the trail. The rancher asked the sheriff if he knew their leader, but the lawman only shook his head. "A man with a scar," he said. "The kind of scar a bullet leaves when it doesn't finish the job. He's not hiding his face. That tells me he wants folks to know he's close." The rancher returned home with those words ringing in his ears. He found her sitting at the table, her hands folded tight as though she had been waiting. When he told her about the scar, she closed her eyes, her whole body trembling. "It's him," she whispered. "I knew he'd find me." For a long moment she said no more, and the rancher did not press. He felt anger rise like fire, but he kept it steady, locking it down inside. She looked at him then, her face pale but her eyes hard. "He won't stop until he takes back what he thinks I stole. And he'll cut down anyone who stands in his way." The rancher leaned close, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Then let him come. He'll find I'm not so easy to cut down." That night neither of them slept. The rancher sat by the window with his rifle laid across his knees, watching the land for any flicker of movement. The widow sat near the fire, her face lost in the glow, her hands clasped in her lap. Thunder rolled faint in the distance, though. The sky remained clear. It was the kind of night when every sound felt sharper, every shadow longer, every heartbeat louder. Toward dawn, he thought he heard hooves in the distance, faint and steady, but they never came closer. When morning broke, the land was quiet again, yet the silence felt more dangerous than the sound. The days that followed pressed them harder. The rancher worked from dawn to dusk, strengthening fences, checking water lines, moving cattle closer to the homestead. He told himself it was precaution, yet in truth he knew he was preparing for something more. He spotted signs near the far. Pasture hoof prints too many for strays, ashes from a campfire still warm beneath the dust. Someone was circling the land, watching, waiting. Each night he returned to the cabin with the same grim look, and each night she met his eyes with fear she could no longer hide. One evening, he rode into town for supplies and found the saloon quieter than usual, men gathered in tight knots, voices low. The barkeep gave him a hard look and leaned in close. "They're talking about you," he muttered, "talking about her. Some say you're harboring trouble, that it'll spill over on all of us." The rancher's jaw tightened. He bought what he needed and left, but as he mounted his horse he felt the weight of the town's eyes on his back. It was not only the outlaws pressing against him now, it was the suspicion of neighbors, the slow turning of trust into doubt. Back at the ranch he found her pacing the yard, her hands wringing at her apron. When he told her what the town had said, she turned away, shame darkening her face. "I should have gone before it came to this," she murmured. He caught her shoulders and held her steady. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We'll face it together." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, though he knew her guilt cut deep. That night, the first sign came that the waiting was almost over. A shot cracked in the distance, echoing through the hills, sharp enough to rattle the cattle and send the dogs barking. The rancher rushed outside, scanning the dark, rifle in hand. For a long while, nothing moved, nothing stirred, until a faint flicker of firelight showed on the far ridge. Someone was out there, making sure they were seen. When he returned inside, she was standing by the door, her face pale as frost. "It's a warning," she said. "He's letting us know he's close." The rancher set his jaw. "Then he's close enough to bleed if he tries." The following days dragged like heavy chains. The widow kept to the cabin, her eyes haunted, her hands trembling whenever the wind carried the sound of hoofbeats. The rancher worked harder than ever, though every task was shadowed by the knowledge that eyes were watching him. He thought often of his father's words about trust and legacy, about how a man's life was built not just on his work, but on the choices he made when tested. He knew the test was coming, and he knew it would break or bind everything he had built. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and the sky burned red, the rancher spotted a rider in the distance. The figure sat still on the ridge, outlined against the dying light, watching. The rancher felt the hair rise on his neck. He raised his rifle, but before he could steady the shot, the rider turned and disappeared into the hills. It was not the attack he had braced for, it was worse. It was the promise of what was to come. When he told her, she did not speak, only gripped his arm as though holding herself upright. The tension wound tighter still. The nights grew longer, filled with silence broken only by distant cries of coyotes and the restless shifting of the cattle. The widow grew thinner, her face pale, her strength fading beneath the weight of her fear. Yet there were moments when her spirit flared, when she met his gaze with steel in her eyes. "If he comes," she said once, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "I won't hide behind you." The rancher's chest tightened, pride and fear warring inside him. "You'll do what you must," he said, "but he'll have to go through me first." The sheriff rode out one last time before the storm broke. He warned the rancher that the scarred man and his riders had been seen near the old canyon, a place not 2 days' ride from the ranch. "They're coming," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "I can raise men from town, but they won't stand long against a pack like his. You'd do better to take her and go." The rancher shook his head. "This is my land," he answered, "and I won't run from any man." The sheriff gave him a long, hard look, then tipped his hat and rode off, leaving the rancher with the weight of his choice. That night, the widow stood with him on the porch as the wind rose, carrying the smell of dust and smoke. The land stretched dark and silent, but the rancher felt the storm coming, not of weather but of men. She leaned into him, her voice soft, but certain. "It won't be long now." He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He could feel it too, the stillness before the break, the quiet before the fire. Somewhere out there, the scarred man. And his riders waited, circling closer with each hour. The rancher tightened his grip on the rifle. Whatever came, the moment was near, and the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first crack of thunder to fall. The night of reckoning came with no moon, only the sound of hooves pounding through the valley like drums of war. The rancher stood on the porch with his rifle, his breath steady though his heart thundered. The widow stayed close, her hand on the post to keep herself from trembling. The dogs barked wild until the riders came into view, shadows moving like wolves across the dark land. Torches flared, casting the scarred man's face in firelight as he reined in his horse at the edge of the yard. His men fanned out behind him, rifles gleaming. The widow gasped, and the rancher felt her fingers clutch his sleeve. The scar across the outlaw's face caught the light, a cruel reminder of a wound that had not been enough to stop him. The scarred man's voice carried hard and rough. "You thought you could hide from me," he called. "You thought a widow could vanish and not pay what she owes." His eyes cut to the rancher. "Step aside, boy. This doesn't concern you." The rancher lifted his rifle higher, his stance rooted firm. "It concerns me now," he said. "She's under my roof, and I won't hand her over. A ripple of laughter came from the riders, but there was no mirth in it, only cruelty. The scarred man sneered. "You think love will keep her safe? She carries my mark, not yours." The widow stepped forward then, her voice shaking yet strong. "You never owned me," she said, her eyes blazing. "Not then, not now." Her words cracked through the night like a whip. The scarred man's face twisted, rage burning through his scar. He spurred his horse forward, but the rancher fired a warning shot that split the dirt at the outlaws' feet. The standoff held, tense as a wire ready to snap. The rancher could feel every man's finger tight on a trigger, every second stretching long. Then the scarred man gave a nod, and chaos broke loose. The gunfire roared across the yard, flashes lighting the dark. The rancher moved quick, steady as he'd trained since boyhood, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. The widow ducked inside, grabbing the pistol the rancher had left for her. The dogs leapt into the fray, snarling, snapping at horses' legs. Men shouted, bullets splintered wood, and the air filled with smoke and dust. The rancher fought with every breath, each shot taken to protect the land that was his and the woman who had trusted him with her secret. He took a graze along the arm, pain hot and sharp, but he did not falter. Through the smoke, the scarred man charged, his pistol raised, his fury aimed at the widow. She fired first, her shot tearing across his shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. He roared with rage, wheeled his horse, and came again. The rancher stepped into his path, his rifle steady, his eyes cold. "It ends here," he said. The outlaw fired, the bullet whistling past the rancher's ear, close enough to burn. The rancher's return shot struck true, and the scarred man tumbled from his horse, crashing into the dirt with a cry that echoed like thunder. His men faltered at the sight, their bravado cracking. Some fired wild, others spurred their horses into retreat. The widow stood in the doorway, pistol shaking in her hands, her eyes locked on the fallen man. The rancher moved to her side, ready for another charge, but the fight was breaking. The outlaws scattered into the night, leaving their leader bleeding in the dust. The dogs chased them a ways before returning, barking fierce triumph into the night air. The gunfire faded, leaving only silence broken by the groans of the wounded outlaw on the ground. The rancher stood over him, rifle still ready. The scarred man spat blood and cursed, but the fight had gone out of him. The widow stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "You swore you'd never stop," she said, "but you will now." He glared up at her, hate burning through his pain. "You'll never be free," he growled. But his strength failed him, and he fell still. The rancher knelt, checking the man's breath. He was alive but broken, his days of hunting over. The rancher bound his wounds enough to keep him breathing, then tied his hands. By dawn, the sheriff and his men rode in to take the outlaw away. Town that had whispered and doubted came out to watch when the scarred man was hauled through the street in irons. Folks no longer looked at the widow with suspicion but with awe. She had faced her past and stood unbroken. The rancher walked beside her, his head high, though the weariness showed in his eyes. The sheriff tipped his hat. "You stood your ground," he said. "Not many could have." The rancher only nodded, his arm brushing against hers as if to remind her she was no longer alone. Life slowly returned to the ranch, though nothing felt quite the same. The scars of that night lingered in the bullet holes patched in the cabin walls and the tired eyes of the widow, in the silence that sometimes fell between them when memory pressed too close. Yet with each passing day, the land healed, and so did they. The cattle returned to their grazing, the fences held, and the creek ran clear. The widow began to laugh again, softly at first, then stronger, her voice carrying through the cabin like sunlight after rain. She planted flowers near the porch, their colors bright against the dusty earth, a sign that life went on. The rancher found himself watching her often, the way her strength returned, the way her spirit shone brighter, now that the weight of fear was gone. She carried her scars, but she carried them with pride, no longer hiding from the world. Sometimes she spoke of the past, not in sorrow but in honesty, telling him of the choices that had led her here. And each time he listened, knowing that trust was not just given but earned, day by day, through truth and endurance. The townsfolk slowly changed their tune. Where once they whispered suspicion, now they spoke of courage. They nodded to the rancher in the saloon, spoke kindly to the widow at the mercantile. The sheriff himself came often, sharing news and lending a hand. When work grew heavy, the ranch that had once felt like a lonely outpost now stood as a place of strength, a reminder that even in the harshest land, hope could take root. In the quiet evenings, the rancher and the widow would sit on the porch, watching the horizon stretch wide and endless. The prairie no longer felt threatening but alive, filled with promise. The widow leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you ever wonder if peace will last?" she asked. He looked out at the cattle grazing, the sky painted gold with sunset, and shook his head. "Peace isn't given," he said. "It's built, and we'll build it together." She smiled then, the kind of smile that spoke of tomorrow and for the first time since she had arrived, her eyes were free of fear. The story of the widow and the young rancher spread beyond the town, carried by travelers along the trail. Folks spoke of a woman who faced her past and a man who stood unyielding by her side. They became a tale told in saloons and at campfires, not of wealth or fame, but of courage, love, and the strength to endure. The ranch grew with time, but what mattered most was not the cattle or the land, but the bond they had forged in fire and held in trust. Years later, when storms rolled across the plains, the widow would stand on the porch beside the rancher, no longer trembling but steady. Together, they had faced darkness, and together they had built light. And as the prairie winds carried the scent of rain and earth, the ranch stood as a reminder that even in a land as unforgiving as the frontier, love and trust could take root and flourish. The scars of the past would never vanish, but they had become part of this story, a story that ended not in fear but in strength. And as the sun set over the wide horizon, the young rancher and the widow looked toward the future with unshaken hearts, knowing they had earned their peace. Top of form, bottom of form.